Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Nezizwa and Kopano for inviting me. So I've got 30 minutes, but I think my presentation will be slightly shorter, and I'm hoping that we can spend more time on the discussion. So when I was invited, Kopano said to me, can you please come and talk about how to tackle colonization, coloniality, pluriversality, and African situated knowledges in how we understand or how we can do research and activism on sexuality and sexually related violence. So that's like a big, big, big task. But today, so what I thought I would do today is just talk about what a decolonial framework might look like. And so providing a kind of framework for thinking and for research that disrupts ideas of colonization. And so I came up with these three questions that I think we should ask ourselves when we do research and activist work. And those three questions, first is the question is, how has the history of colonization shaped society? So when we think about sexuality and sexual violence, how do we understand it in a context, in a historical context of colonization? How do we reproduce this history? And that question refers to what is it that we do every day, or what are the kinds of beliefs and values that we hold that actually serve to reproduce sexual violence or reproduce that history of colonization. And then finally, the third question is, how do we resist and how do we provide alternatives? So I'm arguing today, well, what I'm proposing today, that there are certain organizing principles which can help us understand the impact of colonization and how it has shaped contemporary society. And these organizing principles are racism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. And one thing to bear in mind is that these organizing principles actually interlink and intersect. So we need to understand them in relation to each other. And I'm not going to say a lot about, what is racism, what is capitalism, what is heteropatriarchy. I'm going to take those terms as understood, that we kind of know what these things are. And then I'm saying that these organizing principles necessarily work within a system or a framework. And there's two components to that framework. And the one is science. So the emergence of science as the most legitimate form of knowledge. And the second is the emergence of the nation state. So through, colonization, the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, the continent was divided into nation states. And we tend to accept that reality without interrogating it too much. And so these organizing principles, they shape our values, our beliefs, and this organizing framework, which is around science, which is around the structure of the nation, so laws, policies that govern our existence, all of these things allow for colonization to constantly reproduce itself. And what I want to focus on today is more these ideas about the organizing framework. And I've written about this in other contexts, is this idea of epistemic violence. So the way in which we do research that constructs colonial subjects in a particular way. So I'm referring to this as the epistemic violence of the colonial encounter. And what I'm suggesting is that in order for racism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy to exist, and to exist as legitimate structures or legitimate ideas, science and all of our disciplines have contributed to making these ideas legitimate, right? And if we think about psychology specifically as a discipline, we know about the IQ studies, or a whole body of research that's referred to as scientific racism, that has created knowledge about different races, and not just different races, but a hierarchy of races. And so typically, you know, black people always coming up at the bottom of the list. And so when this is proven scientifically, right, then it becomes easy to legitimize the treatment of colonial subjects, or the treatment of the other, and often the violent treatment of the other. So this is what the idea of epistemic violence, where the idea of epistemic violence comes from, is that if you can think about others as less than human, then you can act towards them in all kinds of ways, violent ways. And this is, I just put an example here of Spencer, a psychologist who wrote a book called The Principles of Psychology in 1870, and whose thesis basically is that selective breeding and the elimination of unfit races that's how he explains this whole idea about racism, and how racism is the fight for truth, right? So in those kinds of ways, we can see how disciplines can legitimize forms of violence. But it's not just psychology. So I think I'm giving the example of psychology, but we should think about it in broader terms. We can think about the law, we can think about engineering, we can think about economics, and how what we are taught as what is scientific, and our theories and methods tend to privilege or tend to legitimize privilege. And so I always say, we need to think about why is it that the economists have not solved problems of poverty? Why is it that our health practitioners or health researchers haven't solved problems of malaria, and so on and so forth? And perhaps it is because the type of research we do tends to legitimize or serve the interests of the privileged in society. And of course, all of this is because science is seen as the most legitimate form of knowledge in contemporary society. So we rely on science. And the way we understand science often is that it provides an ahistorical, value-free, neutral, and objective understanding of society. And like I mentioned before, so when we have these objective ideas about Africans having the lowest IQ, then they become common sense knowledge in a variety of ways. And even if we think about contemporary psychological research, for instance, in neuroscience is an example I tend to give often because it's easy. And neuroscience often looks at differences in brain types between men and women. And those types of ideas can translate into, when we look at the media and how those types of ideas are reproduced, they can translate into ideas about differences and hierarchies of difference between men and women. Yeah? And then there's this idea of the nation state. And I'm arguing that the nation state is crucial for the reproduction of race, gender, and class hierarchies. And when the scramble for Africa happened, and now we have a continent that's divided into different countries, we don't think about that often. So we don't think very often about, what does it mean to be South African? What does it mean to be Zimbabwean? What does it mean to be Tanzanian? These tend to be accepted as naturally different identities. And what I'm arguing here is that these, this principle of divide and rule that established these different nations with different identities, it doesn't only happen in the context of national borders. Okay? It also happens within countries. So if you think about the history of South Africa and the apartheid system, there was differences in between who actually belongs in South Africa, who has rights to citizenship. Right? So these divisions between belonging to a nation were fortified through the creation of the nation state and the laws and policies that govern that. So we tend to now, even now in contemporary society, we're in a, we're in countries where there are divisions within countries, between countries. You think about the problem of xenophobia, but also how some people are more, have more access to rights and more access to privilege and are more seen as more legitimate citizens, right? And there's the exclusion of others, such as the peasantry, the working class, women, migrants, LGBT groups, and so on, which then we start to understand how the dehumanization and violence against different groups is contained within this nation state. And here I just put up a table of how this actually happened in this country, which is such a great example of how this happened, and how the nation state produced laws and policies to defend and legitimize who belongs, who doesn't belong, who has access to rights. And this happened through a range of policies around segregation, so racial segregation, political segregation, spatial segregation, labor restrictions, educational segregation, and social segregation. And I suppose specifically what I want to highlight about the link between the nation state and colonization and contemporary society is also how these created the conditions for gender-based violence and sexual violence. Because if we look at classical Western theories of the nation that divide the sphere of civil society into public and private domains, what that means is that the regulation of the family unit was very important, because it meant that the society was divided between private and public domains, with men having access to political power, so being located in the public domain, whereas women were located in the private domain and having less access to rights and political power. And we know that through history and having access to voting rights and so on. And when we think about this, it's really important because we see that the control of women or violence against women becomes such an important mechanism to maintain the nation state. Because there are different different myths, right, that are attached to this idea of the nation. And the family unit, as the heterosexual family unit that's composed of, a man, a woman, and children, is central to the idea of capitalism and production, right? So men go to work, women stay at home to look after the family. And that idea is central to the maintenance of capitalism. But what that also means is that women have quite a significant role in terms of reproduction and bringing up children. And that role comes with a whole cultural dimension. So women are the ones who transmit culture. They transmit language, which is why I often refer to mother tongue, for instance. They transmit language, culture, you know, things like food, cuisine. And so women are very significant in that relationship. But then it becomes, of course, very important to control women so that the nation can be reproduced. And Yuval Davis talks about this a lot. She says that the control of women, or their subordination rather, is the base for the social order. And sexual agency, this is from a very interesting book by Jackie Alexander, talks about how sexual agency and erotic autonomy signify disloyalty to the nation and irresponsible citizenship. So as soon as, you know, people are seen as engaging in different sexual practices, it's seen as deviant or irresponsible because it doesn't contribute to reproducing the nation and maintaining the social order that was created by colonization. And here I put some examples. The first quote is by Antius and Yuval Davis, who say, often the distinction between one ethnic group and another is constituted centrally by the sexual behavior of women. For example, a true Sikh or Cypriot girl should behave in sexually appropriate ways. If she does not, then neither her children nor herself may be constituted part of the community. Right? So sexual appropriateness is always tied to ideas of reproduction and ethnicity and citizenship. And then Kobano, who says in a 2009 article, who's talking about immorality, and he says immorality in the history of South Africa is not only about unacceptable extramarital sexual affairs, since the idea of immorality in this context pays very close attention to race relations. In other words, sexuality comes to discipline race identification, and similarly, race classification comes to shape sexual relations. So it's a really interesting quote that, you know, is telling us that we cannot divorce racism from heteropatriarchy, basically. We cannot see the idea of racism and sexual orientation, sexual choice are kind of intrinsically tied and happened in that moment of colonization and apartheid. Okay. So I thought I should also say something about resistance and alternatives and how, you know, as researchers and activists, we can actually engage in work that disrupts ideas of epistemic violence. And I've put this section, presenting this section as a series of questions, because I don't think there are, you know, any clear answers. I can't say to you, you must do this and this is decolonial work, because it's a constant kind of self-reflective process in a way. But I want to highlight 3 things, and that's that when we do research and when we do activist work, we must think about the politics of location, practice, and representation. And the politics of location and practice refer to, firstly, the nature of one's insertion into a research process. So what I mean by that is why we need to ask ourselves, you know, why do this particular piece of research? What is your agenda? What do you understand about the context of the research? How do you know what questions to ask? And I thought maybe we could, these questions can guide us in the discussion. The second point is the relational space that is created in this process. So how will you do this research in a way that doesn't end up being only about you? What makes you the right person to do the research? What is your role in the research process? And how will participants relate to you? And then the imperialism of the research endeavor. In what ways does your research reproduce or disrupt the hierarchies discussed previously? Who will have access to your findings? How will others understand, judge, reproduce the findings of your research? And this kind of relates to what Kopano was saying earlier about the politics of publishing, but also more broadly about the institutions in which we are located and how these institutions are governed in particular ways, and how we think maybe we can do disruptive research, but still being located in those institutions. And then the politics of representation. This refers to how the colonized are reproduced in historical discourse and the legitimization of Western thought and research practices. So what are the processes and mechanisms through which your research participants are constituted? So it's an important question to ask. When I'm doing research with people, am I reproducing the same images, the same kind of images of othering that we know about? How do your research aims and practices reproduce or disrupt the ways of knowing and doing? And what is the languages of your research? So if we tend to do research in English, what does that mean? What gets lost in the translation? And then if it is in English, who is it for? So these are the kinds of questions around the politics of representation. And to finish, I wanted to give you an example of a research project that I've been involved in with Kopano and a student of mine called Josie Cornell. And it was a photo voice project looking at working with black students at UCT. But I want to say a few words about photo voice. And I'm suggesting here that maybe it's an approach that we can locate in a decolonial aesthetic or decolonial framework. And the reason I'm saying that is because of the theoretical, the theory behind it. So it draws on ideas of critical consciousness, of feminist standpoint theory, and of documentary photography. So what that means is that in the process of doing research, we're engaging participants in building consciousness of the social, historical context in which they're in. So if I'm working on for instance, on the topic of sexual violence, with the participants, we'll be talking about where does sexual violence comes from? Can you locate this idea in the kind of historical, social framework? Feminist standpoint theory, so what that means is that in photo voice research or any kind of participatory action research, the idea is that when you're working with people, with participants, they are experts in their own lives. And so they become, in the process, they become in some ways the researchers themselves. So you want to collect narratives from their perspectives. And that avoids the issue of asking whether you're actually asking the right questions. And then documentary photography is about talking about current social issues. The second thing I think that's important in terms of seeing photo voice as a decolonial aesthetic is that it centers participants. So participants become researchers who represent themselves through their own photo narratives, and the researcher is the facilitator. So what happens in a photo voice project is that we ask participants to document their lives using photography. And cameras are handed over, and they need to use their imagination and creativity and tell us about their lives. And the researcher in that kind of interaction becomes the facilitator of a process. the role becomes one of, interrogating. Can you say more about your story? Can you locate it? Why did that happen? So in the process of critical consciousness. And then thirdly, it encourages community mobilization and social action within a social justice agenda. So here I'm basically saying that, research and activism can't be separated. And I think if we're going to think about decoloniality as a framework, this is one of the fundamental principles. Research and activism goes together. Research necessarily has to have a social justice agenda. So I've picked a story to show you that one of our participants created as part of this Photo Voice project. And it's a story that's in 7 parts, so there's 7 photographs. And this particular student defines themselves as queer, gender non-conforming, and is located in is at UCT and lives in a single-sex female residence. And it's very interesting to see how she or how they describe their life and how they describe their experience of violence simply from the fact of being located in this single-sex residence. So I'm going to read it and then maybe you can also reflect on it. So the first, and the series of photographs is about them getting dressed in the morning in their room in Res. So the first part says, there is no existing as a queer black body in UCT. There is fighting as a queer black body. There is running as a queer black body. There is certainly dying as a queer black body. But existing would be to assume the position of an acknowledged entity, and there is none of that. There are situations where your existence is acknowledged, like a quote in a long speech. It only serves to decorate the situation, maybe even to fill the statistics. There are times when you are allowed to show some parts of yourself, so your vulnerability can only be shown under certain conditions, through the mouths of peeping toms who don't tell your whole story, whose only objective is to fetishize your existence and gain a few accolades. When everything about you is only accepted when it's being paraphrased and morphed into political correctness, sometimes all you can do to preserve yourself is to create a vivid first impression, one that makes the world uncomfortable, so it remembers that you're not going to be bowing to its standards, because its standards are clouds that rain nooses into your life, because you're not ready to die yet, even though you think about it often. And even though you don't get to exist, you still wake up every morning and convince yourself to get out of bed, layer yourself with clothes like you're putting on a hazmat suit, like you know that these clothes are the blade that snips the noose off of your throat every morning, because anyone can deny your identity, but the mind goes ballistic when it can't marry the image before it with the idea it has of what it should be. So our ability to cause instant discomfort is like a porcupine's quills. It's most dangerous when we're feeling unsafe, and we die for it too often. But how would you know who we were if not for it? So I thought it was a very interesting story about the politics of location and representation, and how this student actually is disrupting that in their own story. And referring to their everyday experience to disrupt those ideas we have about representation and research. And then it's very interesting how the violence comes through in different ways. And how, it's particularly in this last slide, where they're talking about how they don't exist. And the only way they exist is through this violence. So I thought it was a very interesting story that kind of illustrates some of the things I've been talking about. So just to conclude, I'm suggesting that a decolonial framework for research and advocacy on sexuality and sexually related violence must acknowledge and disrupt the legacies of racism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy and how they intersect. It must understand and disrupt the role of science in legitimizing race, gender, and class hierarchies, understand and disrupt the nation state and the laws and policies that sustain it, and engage in anti-colonial, self-reflexive, and participatory forms of research practice. Thank you.